All right. Well, let's get to some of the substance because you've done some incredible work in regard to analyzing the true power that conservatives have in this very moment. If you watch the news, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, if you watch some of the segments I've done in the past, there's a lot of like hyperbolic discourse regarding Donald Trump, the type of power he has, what he's capable of doing. But you've argued that conservatives have far less power today than they have in the past, especially when you take the historical context into mind. So can you elaborate on that argument?
Sure. Conservatism has a long history. It actually goes back in reaction to the French Revolution. But in the United States, it gained traction in the 20th century, really beginning in the 1960s, when it began to create a mass movement, a backlash against first the New Deal, then the Great Society, and then finally the various movements for sexual emancipation that were gaining ground in the 1960s and the 1970s. And and this wasn't just a cultural movement, it was very much a political movement that utterly transformed the American political order. So many of the things that we now take for granted were not taken for granted back then, but it was conservatism that managed to do that. And the culmination, I think, is a long process of three big elections. First, the re-election of Richard Nixon in 1972, then the two terms of Ronald Reagan and then finally George W. Bush. And if you follow that trajectory, you see that the conservatives were able to win popular majorities for the presidency, and more important than that, they were able to transform. Their real achievement was to transform the Democratic Party. Margaret Thatcher was famously asked, "What was your biggest achievement?" And she said, "Tony Blair." And what she meant by that was that a really hegemonic political movement is not only able to put its stamp on its side of the political spectrum, it's able to put its stamp on the opposition, so that the opposition has to compete on its terms. And I think likewise, you could say Bill Clinton was probably the great political achievement of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I mean, think of the end of big government is over. The era of big government is over. The law and order, the anti-welfare, all of that stuff was the Nixon-Reagan kind of policies, and Bill Clinton solidified and consolidated that achievement. And I think once you have that backstory in mind and you start thinking about Donald Trump, I think his presidency looks quite different. First of all, let's just look at the fact that he was elected once, not with a popular majority, but with a minority of the vote. He only got into office because of the Electoral College, which was not true of Reagan or Nixon. And unlike George W. Bush, who also only got in the first time because of the Electoral College and the Supreme Court, I should add, Trump did not get reelected. And I think that's the first thing to look at. The second thing to look at is that when Trump was elected, we forget this, but he had total control over the elected branches of the federal government. So the Republicans were completely in control. And what did they do with their 2 years of control? They got exactly one tax cut, and that was pretty much it. They were not able to repeal Obamacare. They weren't able to actually get an immigration bill through. Trump was not able to get funding for his wall, which he ended up blaming Paul Ryan for. They were not able to roll back entitlements. The budgets that they passed under the Republicans were budgets that were more progressive in many ways than those of Barack Obama. And so what I think that tells you is that as a political project, the kind of hegemony that conservatives and Republicans once wanted to achieve, Trumpism was remarkably weak. This is, a one-term presidency. And in addition, and I join in many of the criticisms of the Democrats that you guys have on this show. But I think one thing that should be pointed out is actually how little the Democrats colluded with the Trump regime. Ronald Reagan got something like 130 Democrats to vote for his tax cuts. George W. Bush got something like 40 to 50 Democrats to vote for his tax cuts. Donald Trump got 0 Democrats to vote for his tax cuts. And I don't say this as, a kind of hosanna to the Democratic Party, but just to show you the winnowing hegemony, the diminishing ability that Trump has had to kind of command political space and the political terrain, the way that Republicans and conservatives once did. On public opinion polling, public opinion polling on immigration is more liberal today than it was when Trump took office. On things like Black Lives Matter and criminal justice reform, the same thing. Trump tried to make this re-election about law and order, and it spectacularly failed for him. So I think there's a whole bunch of signs that show that the Republicans really do have this diminishing political capacity. What props them up and what keeps them in power are things like the Electoral College, and now post-Trump, it'll be the courts and the Senate. These sort of artifacts of the constitutional order that I think liberals too often hold up as a counter to Trump, but in fact are the props that have held Trump up and the GOP up for some time.
And I want to ask a follow-up because, if the right is weak, which it seems like it is. I mean, they lost, right? That's like you said, that's the best example of their weakness. The left is also weak. Is it like what we always assume, like centrist neoliberals, the center cannot hold? Are they the strongest? Like, who do we got to fight? I guess is my question. Like, who has the hegemony, or is it just kind of like this weird transition phase, and we don't know who really has the power right now?
It's a really good question that I've been, wrestling with for quite a while. I mean, I think the first thing is what I was saying at the end of my last answer, which is it's the institutions, ironically, that are strong. I hesitate to say that a political project like either neoliberalism or the right or anything is particularly strong, but because so much of it depends upon things like the courts, which are counter-majoritarian, anti-democratic institutions. Likewise, the Senate. The Senate doesn't represent, the majority of senators don't represent the majority of the country by any stretch. So those are it's those institutions that, again, the sort of liberal resistance types always worry about. Those are the things that are very strong. If there's an ideology behind it, I would say it's some kind of centrist neoliberalism. I mean, I think we are in this extended interregnum where my big fear is we're just going to go back and forth between a kind of centrist neoliberal multicultural party, which is the Democrats, and a sort of neoliberal white nationalist party, which is the Republicans. And, that's the back and forth. And, the promise of Sanders and the Sanders left was to try to break out of that stasis. And, we've made some progress, not nearly as much as many of us would have liked to have seen. But, American institutions are remarkably intransigent. They are very difficult to overcome, and they are the mediums through which you have to have these battles. And so my best guess is that we are like I said, it's extended interregnum. But I think it's pretty unstable. I don't think that it can hold that long. It has remarkably little legitimacy. And, the thing I always come back to in my darker moments is, if you had asked, a French person in 1786 or 1787, what's the status of the Ancien regime? They would have said, it's doing great. And regimes that are sclerotic and vulnerable always seem to be much more impregnable and invulnerable than they in fact are. And it is the job of the left not simply to point out these systemic problems, but also to point out the points of vulnerability. And I think that's what the left has to start doing more of, is to figuring out where are the chinks in the armor that we can, make more progress on. And I just don't think we know right now.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And, you talk about how conservatives, at least in the United States, are at a weak point, mostly because they don't really have popular support, right? So they do rely on the Electoral College, gerrymandering, and the courts in order to get reelected, to get elected. And so I kind of want to look forward into the future and ask what your thoughts are in regard to the hundreds of judges, federal judges that Donald Trump was able to successfully confirm, including 3 Supreme Court judges. Do you see, because in reality, I mean, conservatives might be weak in terms of popular support, but if they essentially mess with the system to their advantage, it doesn't matter if they're popular or not. They can use the system to their advantage. So can you talk about what you see happening in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I should say that in 2017, I remember it was like March or April. So this is just a couple of months. We're still into the first 100 days of Trump. And I was spending a lot of time pointing out all the things that were not happening. Many on the left were very frightened for understandable reasons, because Trump's rhetoric was so menacing. And I felt like it was really important to point out, look at what he's not able to do. Look at all the ways in which he's being checked. And I kept going over that over and over again. And then I started to notice one area where it was very clear that Trump and the Republicans were actually being quite ruthless and more competent than people give them credit for. And that was on appointing judges. And so it became very clear early on that the Republicans understood full well that regardless of the political fortunes and fate of Trump and elected officials on the right, they saw the packing of the courts as the keystone of their future. And I just want to point out an irony about this, though, because a lot of the resistance rhetoric against Trump that you hear from centrists and liberals is that he is anti-judiciary and that he's assaulting the courts, and that the courts are supposed to protect, the courts and the Constitution are supposed to protect us. And what I said at the time, and I think has become even clearer now, is that the irony is that Trump's greatest caretaker and custodian after he is gone is going to be the courts. Now, we have been there before in American history, going into during the Gilded Age. The left, from 1870s, 1880s to the 1930s, the left was one of the most formidable opponents of the courts, primarily because the courts were the vanguard of ruling against the labor movement and against socialists, but really against the labor movement. It was called rule by injunction. So one of the big projects of the left was how to beat back the power of the courts, which they tried to do over and over and over again. So much so that by the time you get to the New Deal, when the court is striking down, legislation after legislation after legislation in the early 1930s, there was a cartoon. They were called these 4 justices. They were called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because they were constantly striking down New Deal legislation. And I suspect this is where we are heading right now. And it's a hard to know how that's going to shake out. All I will say is if that is where we are heading, that means we are reverting to what was for many decades of American history the norm of the American political order, namely not viewing the courts as the friend of the left, but as the intransigent defender of the old regime, of the old order. And that's going to be a difficult language for the left to embrace, because, for people of my generation, we came of age with the halo around the court, the Warren Court, the defender of African Americans, the defender of sexual minorities, the defender of dissenters, and so forth. But that really has not been the norm of American history. I will say one other thing on the courts, however, which it surprised me, frankly. Right now, we're seeing this with this election that, Trump's efforts are being struck down repeatedly by federal judges and state level judges. But some of these federal judges are Trump appointees, which has been kind of interesting. Nobody's really talked about this because it doesn't fit with, the discourse. But it has actually been true. Like, there's been, in particular, one of the federal appointees who covers the Pennsylvania circuit has been pretty aggressively striking down stuff. And this was actually going on throughout the summer and into the fall because there was a lot of litigation. I don't want to claim that Trump's people that he appoints are somehow going to really go against the conservative order. I don't think that's true. I just think it's probably going to be a little bit more nuanced and complicated than people on the left realize.
Well, piggybacking on that, I'm curious what you think, because we've talked about it on this show about what comes next for the American right, post-Trump. Or certainly in a world in which Trump is still around, but he's not the president. I mean, that's another question. I mean, it seems like Trump has really, in a certain, like, even though he's weak in the sort of grand scheme of things, or has been weak in the grand scheme of things, he has kind of sort of, I don't know if I use the word radicalize, like a small chunk or a decent chunk of the Republican voting base, and that seems to me like there's no going back to the old way. What do you think is next for the American right in the sort of post-Trump presidency era?
Yeah, I don't know is the honest answer. I often look to the 1970s as a kind of helpful precedent analogy, but from the opposite side of the spectrum, namely the left. If you were looking at what's going on the left in the 1970s, you also saw, both a kind of a fair amount of disaffiliation from the left that was happening. You had people defecting, eventually became the Reagan Democrats, defecting to the Republican Party and the right, people defecting from the political universe altogether, which is actually not happening today. It's the opposite, but you see these defections in the opposite direction. And then you also had a radicalization on the left. There was all kinds of experiments in political adventurism and political violence. But if you step back, you realize that this was the kind of the dying embers of a fire that was going out. I don't know if that's the case right now, because we also have this, political economy that is falling apart. And that also tends to, particularly for, 2/3 of the people who are not at the top. And that just, is never very promising unless you have real political organization on the ground. And so I think it's a very difficult to see what's going to happen. And I would probably be foolish to try to predict where the right is going to go. One thing I will say is that I'm skeptical of some people who say that what we're going to see is like a Trump 2.0, a kind of more effective, competent, slicker version of Trump. And for a couple of reasons. First, I don't think that the inability of the Trump regime to deliver when they had total power over the elected branches of the government can be chalked up to Trump's incompetence. Mitch McConnell was right there at the center of things, and you could accuse Mitch McConnell of many things, but incompetence is not one of them. So I think it's more systemic than that. And then likewise, I think that, one of Trump's appeals in a way to his base was precisely that he was such a mess, that he was such a, kind of political, the slovenliness of it all. Because I think that goes to the kind of the performance art that the right is currently engaged in. So definitely. And then you people say Tom Cotton, these people who have the charisma of a doorknob, the idea that they're going to somehow, rally. Again, and I don't want to get into predictions because none of us knows, but there is a way in which the left sometimes is the greatest secret fans of the right and think that they've got this kind of political magic on their side, which I just think is not true. And all the signs are that the magic and the romance is fading. But what is left there, I can't say.
So let's talk a little bit about this ongoing discussion, debate regarding Trump attempting what some believe is a political coup, right? So you've been pretty critical of people who genuinely believe that Trump is trying to stage some sort of political coup. But one thing that has stood out to me is how few Republicans are willing to go on the record and acknowledge the fact that Joe Biden did, in fact, win the election. Of course, Donald Trump has still refused to concede. And so the Washington Post actually reached out to every single congressional Republican, and they found out that only 25 out of 249 congressional Republicans acknowledge Biden's win. Does that concern you in any way?
Yes and no. I mean, it doesn't in the way that I think it concerns a lot of other people, that somehow this is a party that is, shaping up to be a fascist authoritarian party. Because the flip side of that refusal that you're describing is a corresponding refusal that almost nobody has noted, which is that when it comes to the actual Republican Party officials who are in a position to do something, to implement the Trump agenda on this election, namely not to certify elections, not to certify specific county canvassing board votes, all that kind of stuff. Anybody who there has been remarkably few cases, actually, of those Republican Party officials being willing to do that. And so what you have, if you step back and look at both sides of this picture, you have on the one side, Trump's rhetoric. There's three sides to this, actually. You have Trump speaking, right? So you have him saying his thing. Then two, you have Republican politicians not really backing him up, but not really also willing to defend him for the most part, with some exceptions, right? So they're kind of silent. And then you have Republican Party officials who are in a position to do something, consistently ruling against him. And so to me, again, this just points to this kind of uncertainty of the Republican Party, that they don't really know. It's certainly not a coup. The idea that it's a coup is preposterous, because you don't have any kind of concerted action or concerted will to do anything. What you have is, I think, just is this kind of vacuum of leadership within the Republican Party. Clearly, there's an awful lot of them who are simply, just waiting to see how this all shakes out, and just wait. They basically just want history to kind of move itself along, and then they'll kind of get on with it. So I'm not concerned in the sense that most people are concerned. What I am concerned about is again, this sense that you have this sort of a party that's really uncertain about what it's actually doing. And I think that makes it very hard for the rest of us to kind of figure out then what is our plan in response. But I think that's more the reality that I see, is Republican Party officials at the state level moving along the process with I think the exception of I think I've counted 5 cases at the very most out of hundreds and hundreds of officials. Most of them are just passing it along, and then Trump doing his tweet thing, and then you have the rest of the Republican Party just kind of waiting for this to shake out however it may.
I want to ask you about another kind of debate du jour on the left, which is this the left's relationship with the Democratic Party. I think that after Anna's segment on Neera Tanden and seeing all the cabinet positions that have been nominated, like this idea of pushing Biden left after the election or whatever was just not going to happen. I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of like what the left's relationship to the Democratic Party should be. Because that's something that I grapple with all the time, and people say like, oh well, we got to go third party, and that seems like a foolhardy errand to me. But also, like, I look at the Democratic Party and I'm just seeing this, and maybe I'm overrating their strength, but I'm just seeing this kind of remarkably durable institution, like you said, that is just much harder to destroy than we had previously thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt Karp had a really great piece in Jacobin about a month or two ago where he, it was a really sobering piece for the left, because he said, precisely this: the Democratic Party has a couple of key constituencies here that are really going to be difficult for the left to crack. And I mean, the other thing I would add to his piece of the puzzle is the fact that we don't have a really independent, powerful labor movement, I think is a real problem. I don't have an answer to that. I just, I mean, this is going to sound terrible. Obama had this idiotic plaque on his desk that, the centrists always loved to quote, "Hard things are hard." Right. And David Axelrod gave it to him. And the myth around that plaque, and then I'll explain why I'm bringing it up in a second, is, everybody said he, used this to explain, like, the heroic effort to get the ACA, the Obamacare passed. In fact, and this speaks to one of your earlier segments, it was actually because they were thinking about going after entitlements. And hard things are hard. Taking on your left flank is a hard thing to do. But the truth is, hard things are hard. And I think we can see some progress at state level parties with the left really being able to take on some of the stuff with Democrats. And I say that very begrudgingly, because ever since I was politically aware, the left has been like, let's go local, let's not go national, let's, do the state level stuff. And every 2 years, the left rediscovers this idea as if it's some novel thing, as opposed to making the best of a bad situation. But the truth is, that is where we have seen some progress. And building organizational capacity is something that there's just no shortcuts around. I came to the left out of the labor movement, and, that is the long slog. And I don't see any other way except that. I will say, however, that, we get these periodic bursts of social movements. And the one that was the most promising to me, I would say, was the teacher strikes, precisely because they were happening in red states. And it just showed that there are political possibilities that are out there to reverse the political valence and really actually get stuff done that very few of us would have anticipated. And so, I think the combination of both state level and kind of these social movement things are what we have, because while, something like the Black Lives Matter protests that exploded over the summer, I think they show you two things. One is how vulnerable these institutions are in the moment, and then how quickly they recalibrate and recuperate. And turning those explosive moments into an extended movement is really the task of the day. And I just, I don't think any of us really knows how that happens, except that it has happened in the past and it has to happen now.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I really got to ask one more question, because I've been very curious to hear what you think about it. But I want to ask about this phenomenon that we've seen lately of kind of Tucker Carlson-ish right-wing populism, and this call from certain people on the left that in order to build a base, you need to find some sort of common ground with right populists, like someone like Tucker Carlson, or the people who kind of who enjoy his show. What do you make of that kind of realignment, the sort of, the hills rising realignment kind of thing? What do you make of that? Are you do you think there's possibilities there, or are you skeptical of it?
I mean, the first thing I should say is none of this is new. There's a long history of this kind of economic populist. You go back to George Wallace in the 1970s. Go back, Richard Nixon had some similar kind of economic populist cross messaging. So there's none of it that's, Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. That was all that he was about. I think I'm ultimately a little bit skeptical of the ability to reach out to I think let me say two things. One is the left should talk to everybody. I don't buy this, kind of siloing of things, that you shouldn't be talking to different audiences. I just think that's bullshit. And I think you should, get an audience where you can. People move in all kinds of ways that are very difficult to understand, and the left has very little understanding of. So I just think you have to do that. I am skeptical, however, that somehow or another, those are the voters that you want to be reaching out to. Because I tend to think that unless they're very young, everything we know about people's political identities and ideological identities is that, they tend to get settled sometime, between their late teens and their, late 20s. And after that, it's rare that you find the kind of, the kind of changes that we're talking about. And I think from what I understand, most of the audiences for these shows tend to be much, much older. I just don't think that's really where the growth is. I'll also add that when people, talk about Carlson or Hawley or these kinds of figures, like thinking that's the future of the Republican Party, I also think that's total bullshit. Because the Republican Party is the Republican Party, and Donald Trump, certainly made some hay talking like that. But the only reason, this is the reason why the Republican Party never turned on him, was because he dropped all that kind of rhetoric. And anybody who actually tried to really implement that kind of rhetoric would find themselves the way Jimmy Carter found himself in the 1970s, because Jimmy Carter, ironically, was a far more powerful president than Donald Trump, because he actually really imposed his vision, neoliberal vision, on the Democratic Party. And that's why they ultimately, turned on him. And if anything like that were to happen on the comparable side for Trump, on the Republican Party side, they'd turn on him too.
All right. Corey Robin, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. We really appreciate the discussion, and we hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Good chatting with you guys.